Today I'm going to go in and give a fairly long video, very detailed video to show how I calculate the effective rim diameter. This measurement is needed when you're building wheels because you need to know this measurement to determine the correct spoke lengths for the wheel build. In my experience with building wheels, this is a very critical, or probably maybe the most critical calculation, and it's a calculation which is very easy to mess up. So the way I do the calculation is basically I have three methods that I use to calculate the ERD, and I will compare and contrast those three methods or the results of those three methods until I get them to reconcile. And once I get them reconciled, then I feel fairly confident that I have a good ERD that I can use to put in the spoke calculation methodology. Also, a lot of times the manufacturer will provide an ERD, but I have found that it's not clear sometimes to me exactly what that calculation means, and it's not clear to me if that calculation is really correct for the wheel build. So I don't rely on the manufacturer ERD. I do use it to sort of compare that I'm in the ballpark, but I use my own number in the wheel build. So this video has been designed to show the three calculation methodologies I use to get the ERD. Okay, as part of the discussion about the calculation of the ERD, we need to get a clarification or a common understanding of the terms. So to do that, this is a rim, or the rim that I've been using to demonstrate with. I have inserted in the rim a spoke and a nipple, okay? And then what I've done is I've taken the spoke, or taken the rim, and I've laid the rim on a sheet of paper, and then I've outlined the rim and the nipple and the spoke on this sheet of paper. And on this sheet of paper, I have the terms that I'm going to be referring to as we talk about this calculation. So this would be the ERD calculation terms. This represents the rim. This black line is going to be referred to as the external rim edge. The red line here in the very bottom of the red line is going to be referred to as the internal rim edge. The other side of that red line, or the other edge of that red line, I'm going to refer to as the internal rim edge. One of the concepts we need to deal with is the thickness of the internal rim edge, and that's shown here. We also are going to need to determine the distance between the between the external and internal rim edges. So that's shown here, okay? Now, the green item here represents the nipple, and the black item running through the nipple is the spoke. On this spoke, I've drawn an arrow here to the end point of the spoke. So once the nipple is inserted in the rim and the spoke is in the nipple, exactly where we want the spoke to be, that's where the end point of the spoke would be, in the nipple, in the rim. And as I said, the green item is the nipple. Now we also need to be concerned about a distance, and that distance is the distance of the spoke end above the internal rim edge. Okay? So those are the concepts that we need to deal with as we move forward in the calculation. Okay, before we get into the methods, there's one other thing I want to highlight, and that is, let's explain exactly where we want to end up. So this is a spoke, a threaded end of a spoke, and this is a spoke nipple, okay? And if you can see on the top of the spoke, there's an indentation. And what we want to do is we want the spoke length so that when the wheel's at proper tension, the spoke will come right up to that indentation inside the nipple. So if we put the spoke, thread the spoke into the nipple, and I put a screwdriver in that indentation, we want the spoke to come right up and butt right up against the end of that screwdriver in that nipple. This would be too far. The spoke, in this case, would be too long. And if the spoke does not come up to the place in the nipple where the indentation is, the spoke would be too short. So once again, the goal is to have that spoke in that nipple so that it butts right up against that screwdriver tip. That's the goal. Okay, this is the first method I'm going to show on how I calculate the ERD. And what I have here, I have a little jig that I've set up to facilitate the calculation. I have placed the rim on the jig, and this method is referred to as the spoke method because basically what you're doing is you're taking two spokes and two nipples, and you're using those, you're placing those in the rim and using those to calculate the ERD. So what I've done, I've already, on this jig, just to facilitate, you don't need a jig like this, but it does help. I have already inserted the spoke, and what you do is you make sure the spokes are in a nipple or in holes in the rim that are exactly diagonally across from each other on the rim. And the first spoke, or the spokes have been put together so that they are in the nipple exactly where you want the spoke to end in the nipple on the wheel build. So as I referred to earlier, the spokes are right up in the nipple, right up at the point they stop right where the indentation on the head of the spoke is. So the first the first spoke length is 200, and the second spoke length, this longer one, is 300 milliliters. So once you put them in, you make sure they're tight, and then you take a caliper and lay the caliper and measure the distance. In this particular case, the distance between the two spokes is 67 milliliters. So the EDR for this particular rim, based on this method, would be 567 millimeters. So this summarizes what we've done here for the EDR calc method number 1, also referred to as the spoke method. The length of spoke, or the spoke length, the first spoke X, was 200 millimeters. The spoke length Y was 300 millimeters. And the gap that I measured with the caliper was 67 millimeters. So when you add those up, you come up with 567, which is the estimated ERD using method 1. Okay, this is the second method that I use to calculate the ERD. And in this method, once again, I have the rim up on my little stand here that I've created. I have one block that's 289 millimeters and another block that's 112 millimeters. I refer to this second method as the block method. On the blocks, I've inserted nipples. Right there, you can see I put a nipple in that block. and a nipple in this block. Once again, I get adjacent holes in the rim, and I insert the nipples that are on the end of the blocks, and then I press the blocks apart and create a gap. Then what I want to do is come in and measure the gap. Okay? So in this particular case, when I measure the gap, I'm sitting at 157 millimeters for the gap. For the block method, or method number 2, you need some additional measurements. And specifically, I need the measurement, going back to this ERD calc terms, I need the distance of the spoke end above the internal rim edge. So I need the distance of the spoke above the internal rim edge. I've measured it with my caliper to be 1.5 millimeters. I need it for both sides, so that would be 2 times. So 2 times 1.5 is 3 millimeters. In addition, I need the thickness of the internal rim edge. And so in my calculation, I need the thickness of the internal rim edge, and I've calculated it to be 3 millimeters. I need both sides, so that's 2. So 2 times the 3 millimeters gives me 6. So under the block method, the first block was 289 millimeters. The second block was 112 millimeters. The gap I measured was 157. The distance of the spoke end above the internal rim edge times 2 would be 3 millimeters. And the thickness of the internal rim edge for both sides is 6 millimeters. And when I add all those up, I get an estimated ERD under the second method of 567 millimeters. Okay, this is the third method that I use to calculate the ERD. And in this particular method, you need a long, flat surface here, which is this board. Then on the rim itself, you need to take the rim and put a little mark on it. Here I put a little white mark right here on the rim. This method is also referred to as the pi method. And so for this method, you set the rim up and put the rim so that the little white mark begins right at the edge of where you're going to start measuring it. And then you roll the rim down all the way until you get to where the white mark is. And when you get to where the white mark is, you come in and mark the white mark right there. So there's where the white mark stopped. Then you come in and you take a tape measure and you measure from where you started down to where the mark is. And in this particular case, it's 187 centimeters or 1,870 millimeters. And that is the external circumference of the rim. Okay, now that you have the external circumference of the rim, we can start doing some calculations. So this is the ERD calculation methodology number 3, referred to as the pi method. I measured the external rim circumference at 1,870 millimeters. Pi is 3.14, roughly. So the circumference divided by pi would give us 596, which would be the diameter of the rim. But going back over to our chart, that is the external rim edge that I've calculated the diameter to, and I need to adjust that. So the first thing I need to do is I need the distance between the external and internal rim edges. So I need the distance from here to here, or this distance I'm showing right here on my little term, the distance between the external and internal rim edges. And in this particular case, I've calculated that with my caliper by going into the rim. And the distance between the external and internal rim edges is 19 millimeters. I need both sides, so that would be 38 millimeters. So when I subtract the 59 from the 38, I now would have, basically the calculated distance between the internal rim edges, okay? Now I also need the distance of the spoke end above the internal rim edge, and I've calculated that to be 1.5 millimeters, and I need both sides of that. So 2 times the 1.5 would be 3 millimeters. And then I also need the thickness, so that's the little red area here, the thickness of the internal rim edge, as I've shown right here on the diagram. And the thickness of the internal rim edge is 3 millimeters. Both sides of that is 2, so 2 times 3 would be 6. When I add all of this up, the 596, subtract the 38, add the 3, add the 6, I get an estimated ERD using the pi method, or my third method, of 567 millimeters. So to summarize the 3 different methods, under the spoke method, or method number 1, I calculated an ERD of 567. Under method number 2, the block method, I estimated an ERD of 567. And under the ERD method calculation, method 3, the pi method, I estimated 567. So in this case, I've got the same measurement on all 3. Well, that concludes my video here on how to calculate the ERD using 3 different methods. In this particular example, I got exactly the same EDR under all 3 methods. That doesn't necessarily happen. A lot of times I have to sort of finesse and work with it. Normally they're close, but anyway, using the 3 different methods, you can kind of get a good feel of a good estimate of what you want the ERD. In this particular case, the manufacturer suggested 569. But if I were doing the calculation, I would go with my estimated 567. So I hope that was helpful, gave you some stuff to think about if you're looking at a wheel build, and give you some ways to confirm or validate your calculations. Hope it was helpful. I'll see you guys at the top.